Hey everybody, I'm Eric, and today we're going to kick off a whole summer-wide series looking at creating a character from start to finish. So we're going to start from nothing in ZBRUSH and go through building a face, building a base body, adding armor, topology, UVs, texturing, all that stuff. So we're going to spend the next couple months basically going step by step through the whole process. Each of these videos are still going to be as one-off as possible, but for people that are following along, they're going to see the progression from starting out with an idea all the way through to the final result. And so with that, today we're going to focus on a face. So we're going to jump into ZBRUSH and sculpt a face from a sphere, and then we're going to begin to build on that over a course of several videos. So let's go ahead and jump in and get started. So like I mentioned in the beginning, we're going to start from a sphere, and the first thing you need to do is take that sphere, make Polymesh 3D, and then begin shaping it into the rough shape of a skull. Now, it's kind of ambiguous when you say stylized character because there's a huge range of stylization where you can take real life and slightly stylize it, or you can go all the way to the Disney spectrum where you're giving your character really large eyes and you're really limiting the amount of detail and wrinkles and small detail in the face to kind of keep it clean overall. Now, as you've seen in the beginning, I'm going to go for a slight stylization. So not realism, but not extremely stylized. I'm kind of just going for more of a subtle stylized approach. And we can kind of build on that from there. And so one of the main reasons I wanted to do this in kind of a time-lapsed format is that I wanted to show you that the way I work and the way a lot of artists work is the first strokes you put down aren't like magically going to be perfect and look correct. There's some artists out there who are just able to like be like, boom, collarbone, boom, cheekbone, and it looks like perfect and they don't have to adjust it. And that's incredible. But the way I've learned and the way I think a lot of people are is that things look worse before they get better. And so the way I like to work is just to get something on the canvas. So I like to get all of my major things in. Get the head in, get the eye sockets in, the nose in, the mouth, ears, all that sort of thing. And so we have something that we can build on. And then once we have all our major forms on the canvas, then we start working it into something that we want. Obviously, if you have a concept or something to work from, that's going to help guide you a lot better. I'm going into this blind, just kind of going with what I feel like I want to do. And as it starts to come together, then I start to have a better idea of the shapes and the style that I'm going to go for. So this is almost like sort of Overwatch, but not quite, maybe a little more in its own direction, but overall that kind of stylization. Even when you're doing stylized characters, it's still good to look at realistic reference to get an idea of the way curves and edges on the face flow and basically the general aesthetic or ethnicity or look or just anything that can kind of help guide your execution. That's going to help because you can look at real life and look at certain curves and certain shapes, and then you can exaggerate those shapes to fit your stylization. And so that's kind of what I'm doing oftentimes, just off to the side, looking up different faces or Googling different people and things like that. And then kind of finding what I think works or what I want to do with this character. And like I mentioned, it's going to be really scuffed at first, and it's going to be scuffed for a while. It's going to get worse before it gets better, but eventually you start to have something and you can kind of see a seed of something, and then you start working towards that. So as you can see with this model, the way I like to work is I start with a sphere, I block out the general shape of the face, and then I'll either Dynamesh a cylinder underneath to create the neck, or I'll just do a circle mask at the bottom of my head, pull that down, Dynamesh it, and then you've got a neck. Same with the ears. I'll basically just mask the shape of an ear, invert that, and then pull that geometry out, the shape of an ear, and then we can Dynamesh, and then we have some shapes that we can work with, turn into ears. And so now at this phase, once I have a character mostly established, I'm going to begin just roughing out the next level of detail so that I can start to figure out what kind of character I want this to be. I'm thinking about making this character a kind of necromancer. So she's going to be like a evil necromancer, magey warlock kind of character. Maybe inspired by like Diablo 4. I seen that necromancer trailer a couple weeks ago and I thought that was really cool. So we might do something like that, but we'll see. First though, we're just going to try to get a cool face on the canvas. In terms of sculpting anatomy and sculpting faces, there's no better advice I can give you than to just practice. Like it just takes time, and you have to sculpt a lot of faces. And I think part of the reason that my process is the way it is, where it looks really scuffed at first and then I kind of pull it into something that looks good or looks acceptable, is because I don't sculpt enough faces. I don't get to do faces on a daily basis. And if I, really focus on, say, maybe doing a face exercise or a face speed sculpt every day, I think this process from it looking really scuffed to looking like something that is actually a face would be much shorter. And so I definitely recommend doing exercises, right? Every character or everything you sculpt doesn't have to be like a final piece. You could just spend 30 minutes or an hour just doing speed sculpts and do those over the course of a couple of weeks, or maybe once a week or twice a week or something like that. And over time, you're going to build up a artistic understanding of how the face looks. And you're going to begin to understand the morphology of a face. And so, while it's very important to learn anatomy and learn underlying structure, like where bones are and muscles and stuff like that, you don't need to memorize that stuff on an anatomical level. If you're interested in that, absolutely go for it. But really what's more important is understanding how skin and fat flows on top of all that anatomy and how that affects the light and the shape of the face. And so that's what people refer to as morphology. You might have seen that before. And it's really just kind of understanding the flow of forms and how those are affected by what's underneath. So, sometimes I've seen people do exercises where they build a skeleton and then they build the musculature on that skeleton on top of it, and then they build the face on top of that. And you could totally do that if you want, but don't feel like you're falling behind or failing for not like knowing what these muscles are, these bones are, or all that sort of thing. As long as you know how to look at anatomy and look at a skeleton and look at the morphology of the face and understand how to translate that to what you're doing, that's completely fine. Some people are interested in that kind of thing and they take it further. And if you're that kind of person, that's sick. That's super, super cool and very valuable, but don't feel like that's something you have to spend your time doing. At the end of the day, we just are trying to interpret what we see in real life. And so by using your observational ability to look at something and figure out how to translate that with your hands into an art, into a sculpt or a drawing or a painting or whatever, then you're succeeding at what you're trying to accomplish. Now, I probably made some art teachers and some more fine artists just die in their seats. So I'm sorry, but that's the thing. I like anatomy, and I do spend a lot of time looking at anatomy. I look at it in how it works for my character and not completely stressing about every little muscle and ligament and bone that is underneath the surface. A few weeks ago, maybe a month or two at this point, we looked at how to nicely build a mouth cavity for your character using ZModeler and keeping it really clean and getting a really nice result. Here's a quick and dirty way to add a mouth cavity to your character if you're just doing a sculpt and you don't want to retopologize it and worry about all of that. You can actually use booleans inside of ZBRUSH. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and take a sphere and we're going to roughly position and shape that sphere into the shape of a mouth bag. And we're going to intersect it ever so slightly into the mouth. And then in our subtool panel, we're going to set that mouth bag to subtract. You can see that there in the layers. We're going to set it to subtract. And then up in render, we're going to turn on live booleans. And you can see now as we position that sphere, it's actually cutting a shape out of the mouth and it's subtracting. And so we're going to continue to just manipulate that sphere and move it into place so that we have once we're happy with the position, we're going to go to our subtool palette, find the Boolean section, and we're going to do Make a Boolean Mesh, and bam. Now we're going to have Geo with a mouth bag, and that's got a full interior from our sphere. So that's a quick and dirty way to do it. That's a little faster than what we looked at in that video a couple of weeks ago, so feel free to use that. And then we're going to just go ahead and Z-remesh this head to get some cleaner Geo so we can then clean it up and continue working. And you can see there's the mouth bag just like we wanted. And And you can see how nasty the geometry is, so that's why we need to ZBRUSH and clean it up. Before I ZBRUSH it, I'm going to go down to deformation polish and just run a polish so it smooths out around those lips. That's just going to help the ZBRUSH algorithm out a little bit and give me less wonkiness. You can see there default ZBRUSH gives us pretty good results, but I want a little bit more control, so I'm going to use the ZBRUSH guides brush. You can choose that and draw ZBRUSH guides, and I'm just going to do some rough lines around the eye, the mouth, the overall flow of the head, and the ear, and then I'm going to run my ZBRUSH, and those are going to help influence the directionality of our final topology once the ZBRUSH is finished, and that just gives us a little better of a result. So if you're not happy with ZBRUSH by default, try out those guides and you might be able to get a more controlled edge flow. Now that we have a new retopologized head with a mouth bag and everything, I'm just going to go ahead and really spend some time on the interior of those lips. Like we've discussed in previous videos, it's really important to get kind of the whole shape inside the mouth, because even though you can't see inside the mouth, the way the shading and lighting hits the interior of the mouth as it rolls outwards on the lips is going to make a huge difference and impact how you feel about your model. So make sure to spend some time really getting that nice and looking good. And as we move forward, you're going to see me jumping around a lot, working on the nose for a little bit, working on the mouth, working on the ears. And that's a perfectly good way to work, because sometimes you kind of need to bring everything up a percent here, a percent there, and then it all starts to come together, because nothing's ever completely finished. It's only finished when you decide it's finished. And so by kind of jumping around, refining something, trying something else, refining that, we'll start to bring the whole head together towards completion. And it just kind of keeps you from getting too bored or too stale or focus in on one area. If you like to be more focused, finish one area and then move on to the next, that's fine. But I know myself and a lot of people like to jump around a lot. You'll see that in time lapses pretty often. Let's look at where we're at right now. We're not bad. We've got a head. It's got lips. It's got eyes. There's ears, there's a nose. It's not amazing. It's pretty generic. Doesn't really have any forms or anything that really stand out that give it strong personality or strong character, but it's a head. Portions need adjustment, but that's okay. That's what we can do now. So now that we have everything in place, we have a good mesh to sculpt on, we have a good foundation. Now we can really start to get into the details and turn this into a character that looks interesting and has personality and is something that we're proud of. So at this stage, we're just going to kind of start to really modify those forms, really focus on that anatomy, and try to dial things in. Areas that I knew I wasn't happy with was the eyelids and the eyebrows, the way those were falling together. Obviously, that cheek line looking from the 3/4 was just really caving in a little too much and just maybe a bit too narrow on the face. So I'm going to work that out a little bit. The mouth obviously needs tons of work. The ears are completely unsculpted, but we can go in and start hitting all this stuff and figuring out the kind of character that we want. I like to too, just for my own progression, duplicate my mesh every so often or save off a different subtool of it, so I can kind of go back and toggle through them and see my progression and see the improvement. And then sometimes too, if I'm trying to try two different directions, I might go one direction and then go back to my original and try a different direction, and then toggle between the two and see which I like better. That's always a great way to work and a huge benefit of 3D. And you'll see I'll also switch materials quite often, and sometimes I'll do poly paint, sometimes I won't. And I just think every time I switch a material, it like resets my brain a little bit and gives me a fresh perspective on the model. And so, you know, I'll go from a red clay to a gray clay to poly painting to the skin shader, and I'll just hop around and see how that's influencing how I feel about the character, because sometimes the lighting and shading on these materials is a little different from material to material. And so by switching that, you kind of get a more well-rounded view of your model. And again, just like we've talked about in previous videos, exporting this mesh and throwing it into Marmoset or Unreal or whatever engine and just looking at it in a completely different engine will also help you kind of dictate what direction you should go in terms of finalizing your head if you're feeling a little burned out or kind of not sure, because you know the lighting in something like Unreal or Marmoset is way better. And so putting, you know, throwing your model into there, setting your camera to a 50 or an 85 millimeter, doing a 3-point lighting setup and look at the results and see how the shadows are falling on your character, that's going to help you know what to tweak in ZBrush so you're not spinning your wheels too much and just kind of undoing and redoing and undoing and redoing. I'll also go ahead and just add some really rough eyebrows. I just masked the shape of an eyebrow and then went to subtool extract to extract those as a thin piece of geometry. Same thing with the head. I'm just going to mask the scalp, extract that, and then just pull it out to kind of roughly make the shape of hair, because even things like hair and eyebrows and eyelashes all kind of impact how you feel about that character. And we're not used to seeing characters bald, right? We're not always used to seeing a character bald, especially like likenesses and stuff. And so by putting hair on there, it might influence how you feel about something. You're like, something that felt way off and wrong before, you throw some hair on there and you're like, okay, maybe it's not so bad. So good exercise. I still recommend toggling between the bald version and not a bald version, but I like to get some hair in there just to kind of see how I feel about the character. And I'm kind of going for these the poly paint that I have in here right now is very rough and not final, but at this stage I kind of knew that I wanted to go for like a necromancer, and so the final textures she'll probably be like pale and have that kind of like sunken in hues to her mouth and her eyes and stuff like that. And so just kind of like getting those Halloween vibes with some reddish makeup around her eyes to help me kind of visualize the direction that I might be going in. And that's what I really like about poly paint. I don't do final texturing with poly paint, but I love using it for preview and visualization and getting ideas about the direction that I want to go with the character. Also, don't be afraid to straight up scale your head in like a certain axis. Like I tend to start by going way too narrow on my heads. And so I'll just scale in the X and just widen that head. And suddenly I'm like, oh, that feels way better. Or sometimes even in the Z, when I'm trying to get that ear kind of placed in the correct position and stuff like that. So, just save your scene and then do something extreme, because sometimes we get too caught up in trying to do like micro adjustments and micro adjustments, and we're just like a little bit of move. Sometimes you just need to get in there and just be really rough. Just give it a wide scale, or like take up your move tool and just do a big movement to it, something like that, and kind of helps you see, oh, okay, I do need to go in that direction. Then you can do it with a softer hand and more refined. But we're working in 3D in a digital space, and so we might as well exploit that to get us a better result. Now, like we did in the mouth cavity video, I went ahead and I'm creating a layer. I'm creating a layer and I'm recording on that layer, and I'm just doing a very rough open on the mouth so that I can mask the jaw, create a poly group, and then create a poly group of the upper mouth. And then I'm going to delete that layer so that the mouth goes back to the original position, but we retain our poly groups. And this is just going to make it so that we can isolate areas of the head to work on them a little easier. At this stage, I'm starting to get a result that I'm fairly happy with. So I'm going in and just starting to make micro adjustments, adjusting where those eyes are sitting in the head, really refining some of the folds around the eyes and the eyebrows and stuff like that, figuring out what kind of extra little details I want to add and adjust. Also spending some time to really refine those ears and get into that actual anatomy. You can see from the 3/4, we have a much more interesting curve now, where we're getting some of that jowl and then some of that cheek. So it's not just a straight line, and kind of gives her kind of a more, not skeletal, but maybe bonier physique because she is like this necromancer and maybe she doesn't have a whole lot of like fat on her face and stuff like that. Here I am just switching the material to kind of get a different perspective and refocus on some of those shapes. At this phase, you'll notice her earlobes are huge because I was thinking of giving her like gauges or like some kind of big piercings. I'm not sure if I'm going to do that, but that's why you see the ears so kind of weirdly large right there, because I was thinking of making her kind of like witch doctor-y, like I said, a necromancer, where she would have some crazy jewelry in her ears. So that's what's going on there. At this stage, we're really just refining. I feel like I've found the overall character and personality that I wanted to convey with this face. And so really just trying to clean up warbly geo, refine areas, make sure the curves and planes and things like that are feeling good and feeling natural. And really just kind of smoothing out everything too to make sure that it's nice and clean. Using that poly paint to my advantage to think about how this character might look textured and figure out what forms or adjustments that I might need to make when it's actually textured. So just kind of helps, right? It's all about constantly refreshing my perspective to figure out what's working and what's not working. Just giving her some very, very slight age with some subtle wrinkles. We're staying fairly stylized and fairly clean in our design, so not going super intense on that stuff. Also going to go ahead and add some stylized eyelids just for now. I think in the final version, I want to give them more detail, but I like just getting in some kind of like curved planar eyelashes that kind of just help me visualize what she looks like with eyelashes on. So just masking a thin strip, extracting that. And then in this case, I actually go ahead and use the Z-Sphere retopology to retopologize that into a clean plane, place it where I need along the eye, and then just extract that. Just continuing to find little areas that I can clean up, smooth out, reinforce the flow of the lines and stuff like that. Kind of see around the eye here how actually bumpy and lumpy it is. And in a later video, I actually go on and even smooth that out more because it was just too rough. But for now, it was okay. And just playing around with like adding slight planar variation and making sure that I kind of have a good balance between realism and stylization. Obviously, she's much more towards the stylized end, but kind of defining what that means for the look and personality of this character. I'm just using poly paint to paint some very basic eyeballs. Nothing too crazy here, just kind of adding in some green, some black, and I'm really not spending much time at all on these. They're just for the purpose of helping me feel if the character's in the right direction, and I kind of can feel the proportions and anatomy a little bit better with eyeballs in there. I also have a very shiny matte cap that I can apply to the eyes just so they have a reflection in them and just helps make her feel a little bit more alive. And you can see as we're watching this time lapse, a lot of this is going over the same forms. And that's just kind of how it goes. It's just like you do a little bit and then you're like, oh, it needs to go a little more, or oops, I pushed it a little too far, or oh, we need to go a little bit more. And so just kind of hitting those same areas over and over again until I kind of just get it exactly how I want it. Because you look at it for a while, you get used to it, and then you look away and work on something else, and then you come back to it and you're like, oh, you know what, that cheek shape is just not quite right, or that area around the edge of the lips is not just quite right, or I need a little bit more fat there, or a little bit more skin or weight. And so just really going back and adjusting and adjusting and adjusting, and that's just kind of how it goes. And you can do that forever. At some point you say, you know what, this is good enough, I can move on. But it's up to you as the creator and the artist to decide when it's okay to move on, or when that's actually done. And so that tweaking process kind of continues on and on. I ended up adjusting the chin a little bit, adjusting some of the other smaller shapes, but here's basically the final sculpt that I landed on. Definitely adjusted like the width of her neck and stuff like that, just looking at reference and deciding the direction that I want to go with this character. You can kind of see overall. So here's just the grayscale, and then we can add poly paint onto it and see the result there too. I feel like she kind of achieved the tone and personality and attitude of the character that I have in mind, this kind of necromancer type character. So I think that's pretty cool. And that's pretty much going to wrap this video up. This video was the initial sculpt of our head. In the next video, what I'm actually going to show you is how can we take this stylized head and retarget it to another head that has good edge flow and even has facial expressions in a really quick and efficient manner without having to do it all ourselves, using some interesting tools and assets. So we'll take a look at that. If you're interested in this kind of content, please consider subscribing. I really appreciate it. I hope you have a great week, and let me know if you have questions or comments or anything you would like me to go over in the comments below. I always try to read those. Thank you so much. Don't stop creating, and I will see you next time. Take care.